Greetings everyone, and today I'm looking at the newest, hottest and most expensive ultra-wide-angle lens for APS-C cameras. I have the new Tokina 11-20mm f2.8 ATX Pro. Costing around £500 or $600 this thing is really expensive right now, although I suspect its price will go down a little soon. Tokina are an interesting lens manufacturer, and their designs tend to be quite idiosyncratic. Their lenses tend to have fantastic build quality but very old-fashioned autofocus systems. They tend to be very sharp and yet also have issues with chromatic aberration. As a reviewer, you never quite know what you're going to get. This particular lens's parameters are pretty swell. It has a maximum aperture of f2.8 throughout its zoom range. That means it can let in more light than other ultra-wide-angle lenses, which makes it useful for shooting indoors, shooting in the dark, video work, or getting a more out-of-focus background in your pictures. Also, the lens doesn't get darker as you zoom in, which is useful for video makers. The lens's zoom range of 11-20mm brings it more in line with competing lenses on the market. 11mm is the full-frame equivalent of 17.6mm on a Canon camera. So we are definitely in ultra-wide-angle territory here, although 10mm lenses are actually noticeably wider. Still, 11mm gives you dramatic, wide views, especially useful for indoor photography. And this Tokina lens zooms into 20mm, which is still a wide angle, but it can give you just a little more emphasis on your subject. That's a big improvement on this lens's older brother, the Tokina 11-16mm f2.8, with its rather pointless zoom range. I liked that older lens, but I'm glad this new version zooms in so much further. Tokina are on the ball. This lens is designed for APS-C cameras, but it will physically fit onto a full-frame camera. Let's see what the image circle looks like on a Canon 6D. As you can see, at 11mm the image circle does not cover the frame. Zoom into 16mm though, and you get full coverage. That continues even if you zoom into 20mm. So actually, using this lens on a full-frame camera is a possibility if needed. Anyway, let's look at the lens's build quality. It's quite heavy, weighing in at over half a kilo, and as you can see, it's also rather big. It feels solid enough, but maybe a little more plasticky than other Tokina lenses. It has an 82mm filter thread, so any filters you buy are going to be pretty expensive. The lens's zoom ring turns the opposite way to Canon's lenses, but the same way as Nikon. It's not the smoothest zoom ring, and it's a little heavy to turn, but really it works just fine. Let's look at the focus mechanism. This lens uses Tokina's famous, or maybe infamous, push-pull autofocus system. When the focus ring is pulled down, you can focus manually. The focus ring turns very smoothly and precisely with hard stops at either end of the scale. The front lens element does not extend or rotate as you change focus. When you push the ring up, it disconnects from the focus mechanism and you get autofocus. You can safely turn the focus ring and nothing will happen. Often, as you push or pull the focus ring, the gears don't fall into place well and you have to fiddle with it, which is annoying. Normally, pulling back into manual focus mode will change your focus a little too. It really is an old-fashioned design that Tokina should phase out. The autofocus motor is fairly quick and not too noisy. My copy of the lens focused accurately most of the time, although sometimes, zoomed into 20mm, it would miss. The lens takes a long time to focus if you're shooting video or otherwise using live view mode. As you can see here, it makes some noise and takes its time making micro adjustments. The lens comes with front and rear lens caps and a plastic hood. Overall, I'm not really in love with this lens's build quality. It seems a little more plasticky than other Tokina lenses, not quite as tough, and I really don't like its autofocus system. Anyway, let's look at image quality. I'll start by testing the lens on my APS-C camera, a 20 megapixel Canon 70D. At 11mm with the aperture wide open at f2.8, we see very good sharpness in the middle of the image with good contrast levels. Nice. Let's look in the corners. Sharpness continues to be reasonably good across the image frame, although the extreme corners are a bit soft. Also, we see some pretty noticeable chromatic aberration on contrasting edges. Stop the aperture down to f4 for a touch more brightness and sharpness in those corners, and at f5.6 we see a big improvement, with the corners looking very sharp indeed, down to about f11. So at 11mm the lens is quite sharp really. It's a shame that we can spot this level of chromatic aberration, but then again, that's also quite common for an ultra-wide-angle lens. Let's zoom into 20mm now. At f2.8, the lens shows good sharpness and contrast in the middle of the image. Not perfect, but good. Over in the corners, the lens is just as sharp. That's a good performance, although again, we can see hints of colourful chromatic aberration. Stop the lens down to f4 for a nice boost in sharpness in those corners and terrific sharpness in the middle of the image. The lens does not get any sharper as you stop down further. Overall, the Tokina 11-20mm f2.8 is a pleasingly sharp lens on an APS-C camera, giving a good performance at f2.8 and excellent sharpness from f4. There are some little chromatic aberration demons though, but overall it's a good show. Just out of interest, let's see how the lens performs on a full-frame camera, in this case a 20 megapixel Canon 6D. We'll test it at 16mm, the widest angle where you can get a full picture. In the middle of the image at f2.8, the lens is extremely sharp with great contrast levels. That sharpness continues until you reach the corners, which are very soft and dark. You get a gradual improvement in clarity as you stop down to f4, then f5.6, then f8, then f11. We see less chromatic aberration than we did on APS-C, but the extreme corners never really sharpen up. Overall, we shouldn't be surprised to see soft corners if you're using a full-frame sensor, as the lens wasn't designed to give that kind of image circle, but the lens is usable, just about. Let's look at distortion and vignetting on an APS-C camera. The good news is that the lens shows little vignetting. Even at f2.8, the corners don't look too dark. Stop the aperture down to f4 and they brighten up. However, at 11mm we do see quite an intrusive level of barrel distortion. It's not horrendously bad, but it's certainly a bit worse than average. However, zoom in to 20mm and that distortion goes away. The lens can focus as closely as 27 centimeters. That's not as close as most other ultra-wide-angle lenses. At f2.8, the close-up image quality is, surprisingly, extremely soft, with strong ghosting and weak contrast levels. Stop down to f4 for a much cleaner picture, and at f5.6 we see a bit more sharpness. That's a pretty weak performance overall though. Let's see how the lens performs against bright lights. As you can see, we lose a lot of contrast and we also see quite a lot of flaring. For an ultra-wide-angle lens, that's a bit of a problem, as you'll often be catching the sun in your pictures. The lens's maximum aperture of f2.8 means that you can get somewhat out-of-focus backgrounds. However, I don't feel any grace outpouring over the quality of this lens's bokeh. Those out-of-focus backgrounds are full of highlighting, looking quite bitty and unattractive, which is a real shame. Overall, the Tokina 11-20mm f2.8 lets in lots of light, it has a usable zoom range, and it's also nice and sharp. But in order to achieve all that, Tokina's lens designers seem to have overlooked a lot of optical problems. It displays chromatic aberration and barrel distortion. It also has dreadful close-up image quality and very ugly bokeh, not to mention the amount of flaring you see when there are bright lights in the picture. I'm not a fan of its build quality either, or its focus system. I think that this lens could be very good indeed for filmmakers who are happy to use manual focus, although the zoom ring is a tiny bit stiff. As for anyone else though, well, it's a lens that can get you some sharp pictures, but you should think carefully about whether you want to part with so much money for a lens with so many question marks over its optics.